Hi, how's it going, everybody? My name is Noah Cook, and welcome to the last and final episode of the Film Format Podcast. If you haven't already, be sure to check out episodes 1 and 2. They are very interesting and full of plenty of information. The first one is on film, and the second one is on tapes. So, without further ado, let's get into it. So, I guess I'll begin by just saying that in our prior two episodes, we explained how film came first, and then after that, they switched over to tapes, but tapes didn't completely take over every single sort of video format. It was mainly used for, personal use, like, VHS cameras, or it was used for industrial, like news or other sort of things like that. They were still using film to shoot most movies. However, then we get into the CD and media card realm where we start to get like completely digital. There's no more analog, there's no use of putting information on little magnetic strips or anything like that. It's all done digitally. So, to first explain how we started to get into this digital realm, when it comes to CDs, the first actual CDs were considered laser discs, and those, played a little bit of music. They're kind of like digital records back in the day. And then after that, people were using them to store other bits of data on computers and such in the 90s and 80s and whatnot. And then memory cards, actually, the first type of memory cards were probably floppy disks, if you uh, consider that a type of card, which it basically is. They couldn't really store a lot of information, and those were basically what were used in computers before CDs and like the very early 80s, and they kind of used them in the 90s, but they started to get outdated. But those themselves were almost similar to CDs because it was just a circular magnetic strip that would spin within the computer, and then it would pull bits of data off of it, and it couldn't hold a lot because, thin magnetic strip and all, but it was still pretty revolutionary at the time. So then, CDs and memory disks, memory cards, etc. They were kind of just used for computers throughout, a majority of its beginning life, but then they started to get more advanced. They came out with the first SD card in the late 90s. It was very, very small, but for back then, it could hold a lot of photos, especially if they were lower resolution. So I remember one of my cameras that I have, it's a 1999 Sony, and it actually has a slot for an SD card, and you put it in the camera. It's a high 8 millimeter tape camera, but it has a feature where you click a button and it takes the photo and it saves it onto the SD card, and you just pop that out and then you put it into. At the time, you would have to get a special adapter because computers didn't really have SD card slots in them back then, but you could still upload it to your computer that way, and you could hold a lot more information. So then, the very first digital camera was made by the Japanese, and it was able to hold about maybe 30 seconds of video, and then it could take about 240 photos. And it's actually funny, the only reason I know about this particular camera is because in a famous clip online, in a Mike Tyson fight from like 1995, there's a person in the background of the fight in the audience, and they're holding up this little camera, and it looks like an iPhone because it's out of focus, but it's actually just the way that that camera was designed and shaped. It just looked like an iPhone with a giant, like, little camera on the front. So I thought that was pretty funny, and I'd throw that in there. But so then they started advancing more, and then eventually they had micro CDs. That you have your think of your typical CD size, and then think of one smaller than that. The tape cameras fell out of fashion, and also SD cards didn't really, they weren't advanced enough to hold that much video, so it was kind of useless to try and, make a camera that could hold like 5 SD cards or something like that. So, anyways, they started using micro CDs and the camcorders, and then they even got like pretty professional with them. I'm pretty sure JVC and Panasonic, they made like news camcorders that you would use, in full scale, like, broadcast productions, and they had CDs, and they would just record onto them in like 1080 HD back in the early 2000s, which was pretty good at that time. But And I remember when I was younger, one of my grandma's cameras, like one of the first camcorders I ever messed around with, that was a miniature CD camcorder. And then, but eventually, SD cards started to get more advanced, and they could, hold about 5 gigabytes, 10 gigabytes of data. And then video quality back then was still not that great. It was still around 720 or 1080p roughly, or sometimes even lower. So they started to come out with camcorders around 2005-ish that were semi-professional, meant for just consumer use, and they were pretty decent. And then around the 2010, you start having your pretty much your normal SD card cameras that you have today. But also within that time, as SD cards advanced and they got better, you know, eventually they were like, well, why don't we just make digital cinema cameras? Because now we can store massive amounts of files onto SD cards, so we can just make a camera with a really good resolution and shoot on that. So they did. However, there are some things like challenges that can occur with, when you have all digital things like the CDs or the memory cards. One of the things that can happen is, data corruption and sometimes just overall compatibility issues. My bad, sorry. But, I've had experiences where I have an SD card, I take it out of my recorder, or I put it in my computer might crash or something like that, or my recorder dies and then the whole file gets corrupted or something like that. If you have a tape camera and your battery dies, the footage just stops where the tape is, and then you turn the thing back on and you just start recording again at the exact same spot. So it's kind of nice with the tapes in that sense, but it can be a challenge sometimes with, the bugs of having electronics at times. And then another thing is when we're talking about filmmaking, and specifically the digital cinema cameras, they have what we called SSDs, and they also can have cloud storage. Blackmagic cinema cameras, they make a wireless HDMI transmitter that you can send the footage straight from the camera, and then it goes to a little monitor, and then it records off of there, and it puts on the computer, so you don't even need a memory card in the actual camera itself. You just need the camera powered on, which is pretty amazing if you think about it. But I also hope that these advancements can continue and hopefully shape the industry in a good way. Like, hopefully they come out with like a 50 terabyte SD card or something crazy like that. So it's kind of sad to see that everything's going digital in some ways, but you can't replace everything analog does at the end of the day either. So, as I've previously explained in my first 2 episodes, so if you guys would go give those a listen, that would be great. But anyways, that's a wrap for our last episode of the Film Format Podcast. Thanks for listening to every single one, and it's been a blast making these. Thanks.